I was taken as a lowly servant, but the alien Empress wants me as her consort.
I woke in suffocating darkness. Not the familiar kind, the gentle veil of sleep, but something heavier, something absolute. My lungs burned, my chest compressed by an invisible force. My first breath was ragged, desperate, like I had been drowning and only now broken the surface. Then came the pain, a dull, insistent throbbing behind my temples, radiating down my spine. My limbs were sluggish, a weight anchoring them down. I tried to move, but something cold and unyielding bit into my wrists. I was restrained. A sharp pulse of fear shot through my gut. Where am I? I blinked rapidly, my vision sluggishly adjusting. A dim, pulsating light traced along the ceiling, casting long shadows across walls that weren't quite metal, weren't quite organic. They pulsed faintly, shifting in ways that made my stomach lurch. I exhaled slowly, fighting back panic. I had been on a mission. My team, the Odyssey. We had been surveying a lifeless moon. No threats, no signals, nothing but rock and dust. Then a jolt, a blinding light, the distant sound of voices turning to static. And now this, a mechanical hiss sliced through the silence. I froze. A faint red glow seeped into the cell, illuminating the space just enough for me to see. Across from me, barely 10 feet away, lay another form, or what was left of it. The body was slumped unnaturally, limbs stiff, skin marred with deep burns and blackened scars. And then I saw it, etched across the figure's throat, glowing faintly against charred flesh, an intricate, shifting symbol. A mark, a brand. Something deep inside me turned ice cold. A shadow moved beyond the translucent barrier. I tensed. A figure stepped forward, the dim red light catching on the smooth, segmented armor wrapped around its frame. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body lean but powerful, built like something meant to move quickly and strike hard. And its eyes, golden, piercing, unblinking. They studied me, unhurried, as if taking inventory of a specimen. The silence stretched. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I refused to look away. Then, in a voice deep and deliberate, it spoke. "You are awake." The words were simple, yet something about them felt wrong. Precise. Calculated. I swallowed hard. "Yeah," I said, my throat raw. "Tends to happen when I'm not dead." It tilted its head, not like a human would, with a subtle movement of curiosity. This was different. A sharp, sudden motion, as if testing the function itself. Then, without another word, it stepped aside. The door dissipated with a quiet hiss. Two more figures entered. These ones were different, larger, broader. Their armor, thicker and heavier, clanked softly with each movement. There was no hesitation in them, no wasted motion. Soldiers. One of them lifted a small device. A thin violet light pulsed across my body, scanning me from head to toe. A second later, the screen flickered, displaying alien script I couldn't read. The soldier turned to the golden-eyed one. Human. Male. Designation. Unknown. Status. Servitude. My stomach clenched. Servitude? I forced a hollow laugh. That's some kind of translation error? No reaction. I took a slow breath, pushing down the rising unease. Look, there's been a mistake. I'm part of an exploration team. You might not have heard of Earth, but we're not. The golden-eyed alien lifted a hand. The soldiers moved. They hauled me up with terrifying ease, my body jerking as they forced me forward. The shackles around my wrists snapped open, but the ones at my ankles remained, allowing only measured steps. I clenched my teeth. Fighting back would be useless. I had no weapon, no bearings, and no idea where I was. Not yet. So I walked. The corridor was long, sterile, its walls shimmering with that same unnatural pulse. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, thick with something floral, yet metallic, like the scent of cut flowers laced with the sharp tang of blood. And then I saw them. Others. Figures shuffled ahead and behind, some humanoid, some distinctly not. A reptilian creature with glistening green scales walked hunched over, its wrists bound in the same glowing restraints as mine. Alive, insectoid, being scuttled forward, multiple limbs trembling. Others bore marks, some like the brand I had seen before, some worse. No one looked up. No one spoke. They moved like ghosts. I swallowed hard. This wasn't a simple prison. It was a machine, a system designed to grind people down until they weren't people anymore. The corridor widened. The chamber we entered was immense. The air changed, growing warmer, charged with something unseen. The walls arched high above, woven with threads of shimmering light, refracting in colors I had no name for. The floor was obsidian black, polished to a mirror sheen. And at the center, at the top of an elegant, curving staircase, was her, Queen Zywynera. She was unlike any being I had ever seen. Tall, elegant. Her skin, a rich cerulean blue, shimmered with subtle iridescence, shifting as she moved. Her hair, a cascade of pure white, framed high cheekbones and sharp, assessing eyes, pale violet, deep and unreadable. And she was watching me. This is the human? Her voice was smooth, refined, edged with something unreadable. The golden-eyed alien stepped forward. Yes, my Empress. He was taken from an uncharted system. His kind has yet to establish presence within the Empire. Zywynera tilted her head slightly, studying me the way a scientist might study an anomaly. Then, to my surprise, she smiled. Curious, she murmured. I expected something different. I exhaled slowly. Yeah, well, I expected not to be kidnapped. Guess we're both disappointed. A ripple of tension passed through the room. One of the guards twitched, their hand drifting toward a weapon. Zywynera lifted a single hand. Instantly, the movement ceased. Then, unexpectedly, she descended the steps. Each motion was fluid, deliberate. Not just graceful, but controlled, commanding. She stopped a mere breath away from me. Up close, I could see the fine, intricate markings that shimmered beneath her skin, patterns shifting like something alive. Slowly, she lifted a hand. I tensed, expecting a strike. Instead, she traced a single, cool finger along my jawline. A shiver ghosted down my spine. You do not cower, she observed, almost to herself. How fascinating. I clenched my jaw. If you're looking for a pet, you've got the wrong guy. Her lips curved. No, I believe I have found exactly what I need. The certainty in her voice sent a chill through me. Because I knew, in that moment, that escape wasn't an option. Whatever this was, whatever game she was playing, I had already become a piece on the board. The cold metal cuffs snapped open, but the weight on my wrists lingered. Even without the restraints, I could feel them, like a ghost of captivity, a reminder that freedom here was an illusion. The guards didn't speak as they led me through the labyrinthine halls of the palace. The architecture was both organic and unnatural, as if the walls themselves had grown rather than been constructed. Soft, pulsating veins of bioluminescent light traced the surfaces, shifting in hue with no discernible pattern. The air smelled faintly of something floral, undercut by a sterile sharpness. I wasn't the only prisoner. I passed others, humanoids, reptilians, insectoid beings, all adorned with similar metallic bands on their wrists or necks. They moved without sound, their gazes averted, their backs bent. None met my eyes. A warning. The golden-eyed alien from before led the way, his steps measured and unhurried. I didn't know his name, but I felt his presence like a blade against my back, watchful, precise, waiting for any sign of defiance. I had no intention of giving him one. Not yet. We emerged into an expansive chamber, its ceiling arching so high it vanished into shadow. At its center loomed a throne, carved from a material that absorbed light rather than reflected it. Seated upon it, draped in iridescent silk, was her, Queen Zywynera. She watched me with that same unreadable expression, her violet eyes studying me like I was a puzzle yet to be solved. Leave us, she commanded. The guards obeyed without hesitation. Even the golden-eyed one gave a curt nod before turning on his heel and vanishing into the dim corridors. The silence that followed was heavier than the shackles had been. Zywynera rose, descending the steps of the dais with effortless grace. Up close, she was even more striking, the subtle luminescence beneath her skin shifting in delicate patterns, as if responding to unseen currents in the air. "You are Thomas Carter," she stated, testing the name on her tongue. "A member of an exploratory vessel. Human." I nodded. "And you are the queen of an empire that kidnaps people for sport?" Her lips curved. Not quite a smile, more a flicker of amusement. "You misunderstand. You were not taken at random. You were selected." A chill crept up my spine. Selected for what? To serve. The word landed with an eerie finality. I swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth. "You got the wrong guy." "Do I?" She tilted her head slightly. "Your people are rare. Few have ventured far enough to encounter the Empire. Yet, those who do fascinate." I folded my arms. "What's so fascinating about us?" Her violet gaze sharpened. "You do not break." I hesitated. "Most species submit when faced with overwhelming power," she continued. "They cower. You resist. Even now, standing before me, a prisoner in my palace, you challenge." I didn't answer, because she wasn't wrong. Zywynera turned away, moving toward a curved wall that rippled at her touch. A section of it dissolved into a viewing panel, revealing the vast city beyond. I stepped closer, despite myself. The city sprawled beneath an alien sky, its skyline a blend of towering spires and floating structures, connected by veins of energy that pulsed like living arteries. Vessels, some sleek and darting, others massive and slow, glided through the air. The scale was overwhelming. This wasn't just a kingdom. It was an empire. Zywynera studied my reaction. "You see now, don't you? The power that stands before you." I exhaled slowly. "And where do I fit into all this?" She turned, something unreadable in her gaze. "That depends on you." I didn't trust the softness in her tone. "You said I was selected. That means you had a reason." "What is it?" A pause. Then, with a faint smile, she answered. "You intrigue me." A pit formed in my stomach. I had expected slavery, torture, interrogation. But this was something else, something worse. Interest. Because interest meant I wasn't disposable. It meant she had plans, and that terrified me more than any prison cell. A dangerous position. I was assigned quarters that were too comfortable. Not a cell, not a dungeon. A private chamber within the palace itself, its walls adorned with intricate patterns that shifted like ink suspended in water. The bed was absurdly large, the fabric impossibly smooth. A table stood in the center, set with food I didn't recognize but whose aroma was undeniably inviting. A gilded cage. I tested the door the moment I was alone. It wasn't locked. That was somehow worse. The moment I left this room, I would be watched. Every move, every word, weighed and measured. A test. I had no illusions. Zywynera's interest wasn't kindness. It was curiosity. A queen did not keep something useless in her court. If I wanted to survive, I had to prove I was valuable. The only question was, how? The first attempt on my life came that night. I had barely closed my eyes when a whisper of movement made them snap open. Instinct took over. I rolled, narrowly avoiding the curved blade that buried itself into the pillow where my head had been. A figure loomed in the darkness. Small, quick, their face obscured by a mask of chitinous plates. Assassin. I didn't think. I moved. I grabbed the nearest object, an ornamental tray from the bedside table, and swung it. The impact sent the assassin stumbling, giving me just enough time to kick them off me. They recovered fast. Too fast. I lunged before they could regain balance, slamming them into the ground. The mask cracked, revealing sharp, alien features beneath. "You were sent to kill me," I said through gritted teeth. "Why?" They sneered. "You do not belong here." The door burst open. Guards flooded in, weapons raised. The assassin hissed and twisted beneath me. But before they could strike again, a pulse of energy surged through the room. They stiffened, then collapsed. I looked up. Zywynera stood in the doorway, her violet eyes colder than before. She stepped inside, her presence suffocating in its intensity. "Remove them." The guards obeyed. The assassin was dragged away, their body still twitching from whatever had been done to them. Then silence. Ziwainera turned to me. "You are already a target." I steadied my breathing. "Did you expect otherwise?" A flicker of something, approval, crossed her face. "You will not survive here as you are," she said. "Not as a servant." I frowned. "Then what?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that the words sent a shiver through me. "You must become something more." I held her gaze, searching for answers in the violet depths of her eyes. And for the first time I realized this was no ordinary game of power. It was a war, and I had just been conscripted. By morning, the palace had turned against me. The whispers slithered through the corridors like unseen predators, their venom coating every word. I heard my name in hushed voices, felt the weight of glances that lingered too long. The human survived. The queen intervened. The queen protected him. And that, more than anything, made me a threat. I wasn't just a curiosity anymore. I had been noticed. That was dangerous. The palace had many grand halls, but this one was different. The walls shimmered with deep indigo and gold, pulsing with embedded veins of energy. A massive table stretched through the chamber, draped in woven silks, surrounded by the empire's elite. Generals, noble lords, advisors, killers in fine clothing. I was led to an empty seat at the far end. My guards, silent and impassive, took their places behind me. I had the distinct feeling they weren't just here to keep me in line. Ziwainera sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable as ever. "Join us," she said. It wasn't a request. The moment I sat, the murmurs began. The nobles didn't bother lowering their voices. A human at the queen's table. Unbelievable. She must be amused. A pet. Nothing more. I ignored them. A servant placed a dish before me. Something roasted, richly spiced, exuding an unfamiliar but tempting aroma. The goblet beside it held a dark liquid, fragrant and thick. I didn't touch either. Across the table, a four-armed warrior leaned back, his lips curling in a smirk. "General Kargath, you don't belong here, human." His voice rumbled like distant thunder. I met his gaze. I wasn't given much of a choice. The smirk widened. "You misunderstand. This place does not tolerate weakness. The queen may entertain you for now, but when she tires, you will be discarded like the others of your kind." A ripple of interest passed through the room. I kept my expression calm. "Others?" Kargath tilted his head, as if considering how much to reveal. "Oh yes, you are not the first of your species to stumble into the Empire, but you will be the first to last this long." Something cold settled in my gut. "You've seen other humans?" I pressed. A flicker of amusement, cruel and knowing. "I have buried them." Silence stretched. Then Ziwainera spoke. "General." Her voice was soft, yet it silenced the room instantly. "You speak as though I allow weak creatures into my court." Kargath stiffened, his upper arms folding across his chest. Ziwainera turned her violet gaze to me. "Do you believe you are weak, Thomas?" I met her stare. The weight of the entire room pressed against me. This wasn't just a question, it was a test. I picked up the goblet before me, examining the dark liquid inside. Then, deliberately, I took a sip. It burned, rich and spiced, something between wine and fire. I set the goblet down. "No." A beat of silence. Then, the queen smiled. Not much, just a flicker at the corner of her lips. But it was enough. "Good," she murmured. "Then perhaps you will survive." I left the hall unscathed, but I knew that wouldn't last. The attack came just before nightfall. I had barely closed my eyes when a whisper of movement sent every nerve in my body into high alert. I rolled off the bed just as a curved blade buried itself into the pillow where my head had been. The assassin moved fast, small, wiry, their face obscured by a mask of smooth, black chitin. I caught only a glimpse of glinting eyes before they struck again. I barely dodged, the blade slicing through the air inches from my throat. I grabbed the closest object, a metal tray from the bedside table, and swung. The impact sent the assassin stumbling. I used the moment to lunge, tackling them to the ground. They twisted, fast and fluid, trying to break free. But I wasn't weak. I slammed my forearm into their throat. "Who sent you?" The assassin hissed, their voice sharp and distorted. "You do not belong here." The door burst open. Guards flooded in, weapons raised. The assassin barely had time to react before a pulse of energy surged through the air. They collapsed. I looked up. Zywynera stood in the doorway, violet eyes dark with something unreadable. She stepped inside, her presence suffocating. "Remove them." The guards obeyed. The assassin was dragged away, their bodies still twitching. Then, silence. The queen studied me. "You are already a target." I steadied my breath. "Did you expect otherwise?" A flicker of something approval crossed her face. "You will not survive here as you are," she said. "Not as a servant." I frowned. "Then what am I?" She took a step closer. "You must become something more." By morning, I had been given new quarters, larger, more opulent. A new wardrobe of dark, embroidered fabric fitted to my frame. A new position, but I still didn't know what I was. Not a servant, not a prisoner, not a noble. Something in between. The whispers had changed. No longer just curiosity or disdain. Now there was something else. Fear. I had survived the assassin. The queen had protected me. The queen had chosen me. I had no illusions. This wasn't kindness. This wasn't favoritism. This was a game, a test. And if I wanted to live, I had to start playing. As I stood on the balcony overlooking the vast, alien city, I let the truth settle in. The palace had no friends, only predators and prey. And I refused to be prey. The scent of blood lingers longer than it should. I learned that early in life. It clings to the air, settles into the fibers of fabric, weaves itself into memory. Even after it has been scrubbed away, it lingers, like a ghost, unseen but present. That morning, the palace reeked of it. The failed assassin had been removed, their body dragged into the shadows of whatever passed for a dungeon in this place. Their fate? Unknown. No one spoke of it. No one asked. And yet, the scent remained. I sat in my new quarters, staring at the blade they had left behind. Small, curved, its handle wrapped in black leather, the hilt engraved with an unfamiliar symbol. Not a standard issue weapon. This wasn't the tool of a soldier, but of someone trained to kill in silence. An executioner's blade. I ran my thumb along the edge, feeling the faint sting of steel against skin. Someone wanted me dead. The question was who? The summons arrived before I could start digging for answers. A pair of guards, different from the ones assigned to me before, stood at my door, their faces hidden behind polished masks. "The queen requests your presence," one of them announced. I glanced at the blade, then at them. I'm starting to think she and I have very different definitions of hospitality. Neither reacted. I sighed, tucking the weapon into the folds of my belt before following them through the twisting corridors of the palace. This time, they didn't take me to the throne room. They led me deeper, past towering columns and gilded archways, past doors sealed with intricate locks and shifting symbols. The further we walked, the colder the air became, until the warmth of the palace faded into something stark and ancient. We stopped before a vast set of doors, black as obsidian, etched with veins of silver. One of the guards placed a palm against the surface. The doors groaned open, revealing a chamber unlike any I had seen before. It wasn't a throne room. It was an arena. The space stretched wide, its walls lined with shadowed figures. Some wore armor, others flowing robes, but all watched in silence. The floor beneath my feet was smooth stone, carved with symbols that glowed faintly under the dim light. And at the center of it all, Zywynera stood atop a raised platform, her violet eyes locked onto mine. She wore something different now, sleek, battle-ready, a long-bladed staff resting lightly in her grip. The queen of an empire, a warrior in her own right. She looked at me, then at the weapon in my belt. "Good. You kept it." I frowned. Was I supposed to leave it behind? A small smile flickered across her lips. Most would have. I glanced around. "I take it this isn't a social visit." "No," she said simply. "It is a test." The figures along the walls stirred. Some whispered. Others watched with quiet amusement. A test, not a lesson, not a sparring match. Something real. I exhaled slowly. What kind of test are we talking about? Ziwainera motioned toward the far side of the arena. The crowd parted, revealing a figure stepping forward. Not a soldier, not a noble, another assassin. They moved with eerie precision, their body wrapped in dark cloth, their face hidden behind an obsidian mask. Their stance was poised, deadly. I recognized it instantly. This wasn't a test of skill. It was a fight for survival. The assassin didn't hesitate. They lunged faster than I expected, their blade flashing in the low light. I barely sidestepped in time, the edge slicing the air where my ribs had been a heartbeat before. Too fast. They pressed the attack, each strike relentless, calculated. I blocked, dodged, twisted away, but they pushed. No wasted movement, no unnecessary force. Whoever they were, they had trained for this their entire life. And I was just trying to stay alive. I gritted my teeth, shifting my stance. My instinct screamed at me to run, to create distance, but I forced myself to stay, to watch. Patterns. Every fighter had them, even the best. And this one, despite their speed, their precision, was no exception. A half-second pause between movements. A slight shift in weight before a downward strike. A tell. I saw it. And the next time they moved, I reacted. I stepped into their attack instead of away, slamming my forearm against theirs, throwing off their balance. Their blade grazed my side, a sharp kiss of pain, but I ignored it. I caught their wrist, twisted hard. The blade clattered to the ground. I drove my knee into their ribs. They staggered. The crowd above made a sound, somewhere between approval and surprise. The assassin recovered fast, but not fast enough. I grabbed the dagger from my belt, the one they had meant to kill me with the night before, and pressed it against their throat. A heartbeat passed, then another. The assassin went still. Silence hung heavy in the arena. Then, slow and deliberate, Ziwainera descended from the platform. The crowd shifted as she passed, their whispers growing. She stopped before me, her gaze sweeping over the scene. "Impressive," she murmured. "You learn quickly." I didn't lower the blade. "Who are they?" She tilted her head slightly. "Does it matter?" I tightened my grip. "It does to me." A flicker of amusement crossed her features. "A member of the Shadow Order, trained since childhood, conditioned for obedience. They were tasked with ending your life, and yet here they kneel." Her eyes flicked to the assassin, then back to me. "And now, the question remains, what will you do with them?" I hesitated. The crowd waited. This was the real test. Not the fight, but the choice that followed. The assassin had tried to kill me. Twice. I had every right to end them. No one here would object. Some expected it. And yet, I exhaled, then lowered the blade. The assassin tensed, as if waiting for a finishing blow that never came. I took a step back. "Let them go." A murmur rippled through the room. Disbelief. Amusement. The assassin looked up, their expression hidden behind the mask, but I could feel their confusion. Ziwainera studied me for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, she nodded. "Very well," she said. "They are yours." I frowned. "What? You spared their life," she said simply. "That makes them your responsibility." I looked at the assassin, still kneeling before me. The weight of what had just happened settled over me like a storm. I had expected death, a fight, maybe another warning. Instead, I had gained something else entirely. A shadow, a would-be killer, and perhaps an ally. The rules of the palace were changing. And for the first time, I was no longer just playing the game. I was shaping it. The assassin followed me like a shadow. I had no idea why they were still alive. Maybe the queen had some twisted sense of humor. Maybe she wanted to see if I would train them, use them, or be foolish enough to trust them. For now, I did none of those things. We hadn't spoken since the arena. I didn't even know their name. They trailed me through the halls, always a step behind, their movements eerily smooth. They never made a sound, never looked directly at me. And yet, I felt them watching. I stopped in the middle of a corridor lined with gilded columns. "Are you going to speak at some point?" Or do you prefer the silent, brooding thing? No answer. I turned. The assassin, clad in dark, fitted armor, their masked face unreadable, stood motionless. I sighed. You've been ordered to serve me, right? A small tilt of the head. Not a nod, not a refusal. Are you waiting for another chance to kill me? This time, the response was clearer. A slow, deliberate shake of the head. I studied them. What do you want then? A pause. Then finally words. Purpose. The voice was softer than I expected. Neutral, restrained, and just slightly distorted by the mask. I frowned. You tried to slit my throat, and now you want purpose? They didn't respond. I let out a slow breath. This wasn't going to be simple. But then again, nothing in this palace ever was. A summons came at midday. This time, the throne room was empty, save for her. No nobles, no guards, just Zawainera, standing by a vast window overlooking the imperial city. She didn't turn as I approached. You spared them, she said, her voice smooth as ever. I stopped a few paces away. I didn't see the point in killing them. Mercy is not common in my court. Good thing I'm not from your court, then. She finally turned, amusement flickering in her violet eyes. No, you are not. She studied me, as if weighing something. Then, she gestured toward a polished table where two goblets of deep crimson liquid sat. Drink, she said. I eyed the goblet. This isn't another test, is it? Everything here is a test, Thomas. That wasn't exactly reassuring. But refusing wouldn't accomplish anything, so I took the goblet and drank. The taste was rich, spiced, something between wine and fire. Zuainera watched, satisfied. Good. I set the goblet down. You didn't summon me just for a drink. She tilted her head slightly. No, I summoned you because the court is restless. Because of me? Because of what you represent. She stepped closer, her presence commanding without effort. You are an anomaly, Thomas. A human who has survived where others have failed. The court does not understand why I keep you alive. They wonder if you are a tool, or something more. I tensed. What does that mean? Zuanera studied me for a long moment. Then, with deliberate ease, she spoke. I am considering naming you as my consort. The words landed like a thunderstrike. I blinked. I'm sorry, what? You heard me. I let out a short, incredulous laugh. That's insane. Is it? She raised a brow. You are already the subject of court gossip. Some whisper that I favor you. Others think I keep you close for amusement. If I were to make the claim formal, it would eliminate speculation. Or start an all-out war? I muttered. She smiled. Perhaps. I shook my head. Why? Why me? You intrigue me. There was again. That damn word. I ran a hand through my hair. You do realize I know nothing about running an empire, right? She took another step forward, voice lowering. I do not need a consort to rule, Thomas. I need one to command respect. Ah, so this wasn't about romance. It was about power. She wasn't choosing me as a partner. She was positioning me as a shield, a statement to the court that she controlled the most unpredictable element in the empire. I exhaled sharply. And what happens if I refuse? For the first time, her expression cooled. Then I will find another use for you. The warning was clear. This was a move in her game, a strategy, and I was the piece she was placing on the board. The question was, did I play along? I didn't get much time to think about it. The moment I stepped out of the throne room, I found myself face to face with Kargath. The four-armed general stood with his usual scowl, arms crossed over his broad chest. His presence was like a storm waiting to break. You must think yourself untouchable now, he said. I sighed. Can we skip the threats today? I've had a long morning. His expression didn't change. Walk with me, human. I hesitated, but refusing would only make things worse. So I followed. He led me to an open courtyard where warriors sparred in disciplined formations. The scent of sweat and steel filled the air. Kargath stopped at the edge of the training ground and turned to me. You think the queen's favor will protect you, he said. It will not. I folded my arms. Something tells me you didn't drag me here just to give me a speech. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Fight me. I blinked. Excuse me? You survived an assassin, he said. You even held your own in the arena. Now, prove you are more than the queen's amusement. I exhaled. And what happens if I say no? Then the court will see you for what you truly are. He took a step closer, a weak, fragile thing hiding behind her power. Ah, so that was the game. I glanced at the warriors training in the courtyard, at the nobles watching from the balconies above. A public challenge. If I refused, I would lose what little standing I had gained. If I fought, well, that was an entirely different problem. I rolled my shoulders. Fine, I said. Let's get this over with. A murmur spread through the onlookers. Kargath grinned, stepping into the center of the courtyard. A weapon was handed to him, a curved, two-handed blade designed for strength rather than speed. A dagger was tossed to me. I caught it, looked at it, then at him. You've got to be kidding. He smirked. You'll have to be fast. Great. Just great. I let out a slow breath. Then, gripping the dagger, I stepped forward. The fight was about to begin. In one way or another, the palace would have its answer. The courtyard was silent. Nobles, warriors, and advisors watched from the shadows of towering columns and balconies. Some leaned forward with curiosity, others with disdain. They weren't here for entertainment. They were here to see if the queen's pet could survive the lesson Kargath intended to teach. The general stood at the center of the courtyard, his four arms flexing around the weight of his weapon. The curved blade gleamed under the twin moons, its edge honed to a whisper-thin sharpness. I looked down at my own weapon, a dagger. Fantastic. Kargath smirked, stepping forward. A consort should know his place, he said, voice low and taunting. On his knees. I tightened my grip on the blade. He struck first. The blade came in fast, an arc of silver cutting through the dim light. I dodged, barely, the tip grazing my shoulder as I twisted away. He didn't pause. His upper hands gripped the sword, while the lower two lashed out. A fist slammed into my ribs, knocking the breath from my lungs. Pain exploded through me, but I didn't fall. Instead, I stumbled back, assessing. Kargath wasn't just strong, he was experienced. Each movement was precise, no wasted energy. He wasn't attacking in blind rage. He was testing me, measuring my response, looking for weaknesses. I had plenty, but if he thought I was going to make this easy, he was mistaken. Kargath lunged again. This time, I didn't dodge. I moved into his attack. His blade swept forward, but I dropped low, feeling the wind as it passed over me. My dagger flashed upward, not for a killing blow, just a distraction. The tip grazed his side. Not deep, but enough to make him feel it. Kargath snarled and pivoted, swinging the blade downward. I rolled out of reach just as steel slammed into the stone, sending sparks flying. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I wasn't winning, but I wasn't dying either. And that was unexpected. Kargath circled me now, his eyes narrowing. The arrogance in his stance faded, replaced with something sharper. He wasn't just toying with me anymore. Now he wanted to kill me. Good, because I had no intention of dying. The next exchange happened too fast to track. Steel against steel, dodges within inches. My reflexes kept me alive, but Kargath was relentless, pressing forward with a ferocity I couldn't match in raw strength. I needed an opening. I needed an edge. And then I found it. Kargath relied on his upper arms for precision, but his lower arms, despite their power, moved with a fraction of a second's delay. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. I feinted left. He took the bait, adjusting his stance, and I struck right. My dagger buried itself into the flesh between his ribs. Not a fatal wound, but deep enough to stagger him. He let out a sharp grunt, eyes flaring with rage. I jumped back before he could retaliate. The courtyard had gone completely still. Kargath stood frozen, staring at the blood seeping from his wound. His grip tightened on his weapon. His next move would be decisive. Then, enough! Zywynera's voice rang out, cool and commanding. Kargath didn't move. His breathing was heavy, nostrils flaring. For a moment, I thought he would ignore her. Then slowly he straightened. He turned his gaze toward the queen, jaw tight. He is unworthy. Zywynera descended the steps of the viewing platform, her gown flowing like liquid metal. Unworthy, she stopped beside me, tilting her head slightly. And yet he stands, while you bleed. A dangerous silence followed. Kargatha's lips curled, but he said nothing. Zywynera's gaze shifted to me, searching. Are you finished, Thomas? I exhaled, still gripping the dagger. My ribs ached, my lungs burned, but I wasn't dead. I met her gaze. Depends, I said. Is he? A flicker of something crossed her face. Amusement, maybe, but it was gone in an instant. She turned back to Kargath. The court has seen enough. Another pause. Then, with great reluctance, Kargath stepped back. He didn't bow. He didn't acknowledge me. He simply turned and left, his warriors following in silence. The queen let out a quiet breath. You have made an enemy tonight. I wiped the blood from my blade. Pretty sure I already had one. Her lips curved slightly. Perhaps. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out so lightly I almost didn't feel it, and brushed her fingers along my temple. A silent acknowledgement. Approval. And the court saw it. They would remember. Later that night, I found myself summoned once more. This time, to the queen's private chambers. The room was vast, lined with crystalline walls that shimmered with soft luminescence. The air smelled faintly of exotic spices, something rich and intoxicating. Zywynera stood near the balcony, gazing out at the twin moons. Her posture was relaxed, yet poised. You surprised them today, she said without turning. I leaned against the doorway. That seems to be a habit of mine. She chuckled softly. Indeed. Silence stretched between us. Then she turned, her violet gaze unreadable. Do you understand what has happened? I frowned. Kargath tried to kill me. I made sure he didn't. It was more than that, she said, stepping closer. The court does not respect weakness. Tonight, you proved you are not weak. That changes things. Changes what? She studied me for a long moment. Then, you will be my consort. My breath caught. I let out a sharp laugh. You're not serious. I am always serious, Thomas. I shook my head. You told me before this was just to silence the court. That doesn't mean. It means, she interrupted, voice calm but firm, that you have stepped into a role you cannot walk away from. I swallowed. She was right. The court had seen her choose me. I had survived Kargath. I had been marked, in their eyes, as something more than an amusement. If I tried to leave now, I wouldn't just be an outsider. I would be a target. I exhaled. So what now? Zywynera stepped even closer, the glow of the room casting soft highlights against her skin. Now, she tilted her head. Now, we see if you can keep what you have won. Her words sent a chill down my spine, because she was right. Winning was easy. Surviving what came after? That was the real challenge. And I had the sinking feeling that my battle had only just begun. The palace was colder than usual. Or maybe it was just in my head. I adjusted the high collar of my formal jacket, the fabric still unfamiliar against my skin, silk woven with metallic fibers, dark as deep space, adorned with patterns that meant nothing to me but spoke volumes to the court. My hands had healed from the last fight, but a fresh bruise lingered along my ribs, a gift from training earlier that morning. Kargath had enjoyed that one. Now, I stood at the entrance to the Queen's Grand Council chamber, waiting, watching. They spoke in hushed tones, their words carefully chosen, each syllable a veiled maneuver. The human is here again? How long will she keep him? The Queen plays a dangerous game. I pretended not to hear. The truth was, I had no idea what Zywynera was doing. One moment she was throwing me into a fight for survival. The next she was naming me her consort. And now this, a seat at her war council. A human with no army, no noble ties, no claim to power. And yet, I was here. The chamber was a masterpiece of control and intimidation. Obsidian pillars stretched to a domed ceiling, where shifting crystalline panels refracted the twin moon's light, casting silver-blue patterns across the polished floor. A long table of black stone occupied the center, where generals and advisors sat in tense silence. At the head of the table, Zywynera. She looked every bit the ruler of an empire. Dressed in a dark, flowing ensemble embroidered with threads that shimmered as she moved. Her presence was effortless authority. She barely glanced at me as I entered, but I knew she had been waiting. "Take your seat, Thomas." That was it. No formal announcement, no speech, just an expectation that I belonged. The reactions from the council were immediate. Some stiffened. Others exchanged looks. Cargith, seated a few chairs down, let out an audible exhale, something between frustration and barely contained rage. I pulled out the chair, sat, and rested my hands on the cool surface of the table. No one spoke. They were waiting for me to make a mistake. Zwynera's voice cut through the silence. "Reports?" An advisor stood. His robes bore the insignia of the Empire's intelligence branch, layers of woven symbols denoting rank and secrecy. "The border incursions continue, my queen. The rebels have taken 3 more trade routes." The room murmured. I frowned. 3? That was worse than expected. "They're being strategic," the advisor continued. "They attack, then vanish. No prolonged engagements. No clear pattern." "They have a pattern," I said before I could stop myself. A dozen heads snapped in my direction. I kept my expression neutral. "They're not taking strongholds. They're not trying to hold territory. They're cutting supply lines. That's preparation for something bigger." Cargis scoffed. "And what would you know of war, human?" I met his stare. "Enough to know they're bleeding you without ever stepping onto a battlefield." The murmurs returned. I could feel Zwynera watching me now, her gaze heavy with expectation. Cargith leaned forward, arms crossed. "Then tell us, Consort, what would you have us do?" I resisted the urge to smirk. "Pull back your forces." The chamber erupted. "This is madness." One noble spat. "He seeks to weaken us further," another growled. I ignored them, keeping my focus on Zwynera. "If you send more ships, you'll just be giving them more targets," I said. "Right now, you don't know what they want. You don't know who's funding them, who's supplying them. You don't even know if they have a leader worth negotiating with." Cargis scoffed. "We do not negotiate with traitors." "Then what do you do?" I challenged. "Keep fighting shadows until the real threat makes its move?" That silenced him. I turned to Zwynera. "Draw them out. Make them come to you. Offer something they can't ignore." She studied me, unreadable as ever. Then she looked to her advisors. "What would they take?" One of the generals hesitated. "A ceasefire. They may believe we're too weakened to fight back." "Too much," another interjected. "We would seem desperate." Zwynera's gaze flickered back to me. "What do you propose?" I took a breath. "A meeting." The chamber stiffened. "Send an envoy." I continued. "Someone to talk, to assess, to see who they really are. And who would be foolish enough to volunteer?" Cargith sneered. I leaned back. "You're looking at him." The silence was heavy. Then, slowly, Zwynera smiled. Not amusement. Not mockery. Something else. "Very well," she said. "You leave in the morning." The nobles erupted into protest. Cargith stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "You can't be serious." "I am always serious, General," Zwynera said smoothly. "He is untrained, untested." "Yet here he stands," she interrupted. "Perhaps it is time we see if he is truly unworthy." A challenge. A declaration. The argument ended there. One by one, the nobles filed out, some whispering, others fuming. Cargith shot me a final glare before turning on his heel and disappearing down the hall. I let out a slow breath. That had gone about as well as I could have hoped. Then I felt it, her presence beside me. Zwynera stood close, closer than necessary. "You are aware of the risk?" I turned to meet her gaze. "Of course. You could die." I smiled. "That's been true since the day I got here." She studied me, her expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, she reached out. Not a formal gesture, not a public display, but a quiet brush of fingers against my wrist. A moment of something. "You surprise me, Thomas." "I get that a lot." She exhaled, almost a laugh. Then, just as quickly, she was composed again. "Rest. Prepare. You'll need more than wit for what's coming." I nodded. "Then I'll see you in the morning." Her gaze lingered a moment longer. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. I watched her go. I had one today. But in this palace, victories were never free. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, the real game would begin. The wind howled as the shuttle descended, buffeted by the unstable currents of the wasteland below. Through the viewport, the terrain unfolded, jagged rock formations, crumbling ruins swallowed by time, and the distant shimmer of energy shields marking the rebel stronghold. The sky was a bruised shade of violet, clouds thick with the promise of an impending storm. I tightened my grip on the seat's armrest. "You seem tense," said Vierick, the noble assigned as my escort. His voice held the smooth amusement of a man who found great pleasure in watching others suffer. "Second thoughts, consort?" I gave him a flat look. "I'm just wondering how many people down there want me dead." "You seem oddly comfortable for someone walking into a den of wolves." Vierick chuckled. "That's because I understand the game. You, on the other hand," his golden eyes flicked over me, assessing. "You still think survival depends on strength. It doesn't. It depends on knowing when to bare your teeth and when to show your throat." Charming. The shuttle jolted as it settled onto the landing platform. A low mechanical hum filled the cabin as the doors hissed open. Outside, figures waited, armed rebels in mismatched armor, their weapons held loosely but ready to fire at the first misstep. I exhaled slowly. Time to play the role I never wanted. The air was thick with the scent of dust and ozone, the distant crackle of energy fields keeping the stronghold hidden from prying Imperial eyes. A figure stepped forward, moving with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to command. Relos. I recognized him from the reports, tall, scarred, his left eye a pale white from an old wound. He carried himself like a man who had nothing left to fear. "Queen Zoinera sends her consort to speak for her?" His tone dripped with derision. "Tell me, human, do you speak with her voice, or just warm her bed?" My jaw tightened, but I forced a smirk. "Depends. Do you want an answer? Or would you rather keep playing with insults?" The gathered rebels stirred at my response, some amused, others annoyed. Rello's good eye narrowed. Then, after a long moment, he laughed. "Bold," he admitted. "Stupid, but bold." He turned, motioning for us to follow. "Cool me. Let's see if you could do more than talk." Vierick walked beside me as we entered the stronghold, his voice a quiet murmur. "Impressive. Though I hope your negotiation skills extend beyond not getting stabbed in the first 5 minutes." I ignored him, my focus on the labyrinthine corridors of the underground base. The walls were reinforced metal, scavenged from Imperial wreckage. Cables ran along the ceilings, flickering intermittently, supplying power to the dimly lit halls. This place wasn't built for comfort. It was built to last. We entered a war room, a crude imitation of the Queen's council chamber, but functional. A round table sat at the center, surrounded by hollow-eyed strategists who had seen too many battles. Maps and stolen intel covered the walls. Rellos took a seat at the head, gesturing for me to do the same. I did. Silence stretched. Then, "State your offer." I leaned forward. "Let's not pretend this is about trade routes or border skirmishes. You wouldn't be this precise if you were just trying to be a thorn in the Empire's side. You're setting the stage for something bigger." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "And what do you think I want?" I met his gaze. Legitimacy. The room shifted, subtle movements of unease. "If this was just rebellion, you'd be targeting cities. You'd be broadcasting your victories to inspire others. But you're not. You're hitting strategic points, not for attention, but to control. You're positioning yourself as an alternative to the Queen. That tells me you don't just want her gone. You want to replace her." Rellos was still. Too still. Then, slowly, he exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Not bad, consort. You see more than I expected." "Then stop wasting time," I said. "What do you want?" A beat of silence. Then he answered. "Independence." I had expected a demand for territory, resources, maybe a seat in the Empire's governing body. But this? I folded my arms. "You want the Queen to just let you go." Rellos smiled thinly. "The outer colonies were never meant to be ruled by Zoinera's empire. We bled to build our own future, but she crushed it under her heel. If she truly wants peace, she'll let us have what was always ours." I ran a hand through my hair. "You know she won't agree to that." Then we keep bleeding each other until she does. Damn it. I stole a glance at Vierik, who had been silent for once. He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. We can negotiate autonomy, I tried. Recognition, trade rights, political representation. Relos shook his head. No half measures, consort. She either accepts our freedom, or she buries us trying to stop it. He stood. The meeting was over. Go back to your queen. Tell her we'll give her one chance to make the right choice. I rose slowly. And if she refuses? Relos smiled, cold and knowing. Then your empire will learn what real war looks like. I left the war room with a pit in my stomach. Back on the shuttle, Vierik was quiet as we ascended through the thick clouds. Then finally he spoke. That could have gone worse. I huffed. That could have gone a lot worse. He studied me. And yet you hesitate. I looked out the viewport. The wasteland stretched below, a stark contrast to the glittering palace I would return to. I was expecting an enemy, I admitted. But he wasn't lying. They were their own people before Zwinera conquered them. Vierik leaned back, considering. So, tell me, consort, whose side are you on? I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure anymore. The chamber felt suffocating, not from heat or lack of air, but from presence. The weight of too many gazes, too many carefully concealed thoughts pressing in from all sides. The court of Zwinera was not loud in its discontent, not overt in its disdain, but it was palpable. I had always been an anomaly here, but today it felt different. I was not just an intruder. I was a problem. Queen Zwinera sat upon her throne, an embodiment of stillness and power. The violet glow of the throne's embedded energy veins pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves, casting her in shifting shades of shadow and light. She had summoned the council to discuss the next step in dealing with the rebels. I had brought back an answer they didn't want to hear. Their position is firm, I said. Relos won't accept anything less than full independence. The silence stretched, taut and expectant. The gathered nobles, generals, and advisors absorbed my words with varying degrees of skepticism. I could feel their stares dissecting me, searching for weakness, for why the queen had entrusted me with this mission. At last, Kargith leaned forward, his massive frame casting a broad shadow across the table. Then negotiations have failed, he said, voice like distant thunder. There is only war left. I expected that response. I even expected the murmurs of agreement from his supporters. What I didn't expect was the shift in the room. A subtle ripple of hesitation, a glance exchanged here, a hand clenched too tightly into a fist there. Not everyone agreed with him. Interesting. I folded my arms. You're assuming they're a weak target. Kargith's golden eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting they are not? I'm suggesting that if they were weak, they'd already be dead. I let that settle, watching as the weight of my words pressed into the room. They're still standing because they know exactly how to fight you. You send fleets, they scatter. You secure one region, they take another. They don't fight your war. They fight theirs. Zwinera had not spoken yet. She simply watched, letting the court reveal itself. One noble, Lord Varos, steepled his fingers. And what do you propose, consort? That was new. A noble actually asking my opinion, rather than dismissing it outright. I took a slow breath. We need to stop treating this as a war of conquest. It's a war of control. They don't need to defeat us. They just need to make ruling them unbearable. I let my gaze sweep across the room. The only way this ends quickly is if they believe they lose more by resisting than by conceding. The court was listening now. Kargith scoffed. You suggest we negotiate again? No, I said. I suggest we redefine what victory looks like. A murmur ran through the chamber. Kargith clenched his jaw, clearly irritated, but even he sensed the shift. I turned back to Zwinera. I asked Relos what would happen if we refused his terms. He said the Empire would learn what real war looks like. I let that statement hang for a beat. He wasn't bluffing. A flicker of something passed over Zwinera's expression. Thoughtful, calculating. She rose from her throne. Then we will make him reconsider. I frowned. How? She descended the dais, moving with slow, deliberate grace. When she reached me, She stopped closer than necessary. I could feel the cold elegance of her presence, the weight of the empire she carried. You will be part of the next envoy, she said, but not for negotiation, for terms of surrender. I tensed. The chamber reacted immediately, some in approval, others in barely contained outrage. Kargatha's smirk returned, slow and sharp. So this was her move. I had given her information, and she had turned it into a trap. If they refuse, she continued, voice calm, we will burn away their options. We will show them that resistance is not defiance. It is a death sentence. The nobles approved. The generals nodded. And I felt something twist inside me. I had told her they wouldn't back down, and she had accepted that truth, which meant she wasn't planning for peace. She was planning for eradication. I clenched my fists. You're giving them no way out. Zuainera tilted her head. On the contrary, they have two choices. They may surrender. And if they don't, for the first time, she hesitated. It was barely a flicker, barely a pause, but I saw it. Then her expression hardened. Then they will cease to exist. The conversation was over. The court adjourned, the nobles moving in waves, whispering amongst themselves, some satisfied, some uncertain. Kargath lingered just long enough to give me a knowing look before departing. Only Zuainera and I remained. She turned to leave, but I stepped forward. You knew, didn't you? She stopped but didn't turn. Elaborate. You knew they wouldn't accept your terms. My voice was quieter now, the weight of it heavier. This was never about peace. A silence stretched between us. Then, she turned slightly, enough for me to catch the flicker of emotion in her gaze. Peace, she murmured, is an illusion built atop submission. I exhaled sharply. You don't need to destroy them. And yet, she said, if I show weakness now, it will not be them who are destroyed. It will be us. I shook my head. There's another way. Her expression was unreadable. Then find it. With that, she left me standing in the empty hall, the weight of her command sinking into my chest. Find another way. Before it was too late. The night air carried a chill, heavy with the scent of rain yet to fall. Beyond the palace walls, the city pulsed with life. Distant lights flickering like dying stars, voices rising in the hum of a civilization too large to silence. But here, in the Queen's private wing, there was only quiet. Too quiet. I stood at the edge of the balcony, staring out at the skyline. It should have felt vast, open. Instead, it felt like the walls of my cage had simply expanded. You're troubled, a voice said behind me. I didn't turn. You expected me to be at peace with this? A pause. Then the sound of soft steps against marble. Zuainera came to stand beside me, her presence as effortless as the shifting of the wind. She didn't look at me. Instead, she followed my gaze over the city, as if she too could feel the weight of what was coming. You believe I made the wrong choice, she said. I let out a slow breath. I think you made a choice, not necessarily the right one. Her lips curled slightly. And yet, it is the only one that ensures the empire does not fall to chaos. I turned to face her. At what cost? For the first time, something flickered in her expression, an emotion I couldn't name. She was never careless with her words, never reactionary, but tonight, she seemed almost tired. The cost of power is always blood, she murmured. The only question is whose. Silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken thoughts. She had given me a command, find another way. But I knew what she really meant. Convince her. If I couldn't, then the war would go as planned, and the rebels would burn. I ran a hand through my hair. There's something you're not telling me. Zuainera's violet eyes flicked toward me, sharp as a blade. Careful, Thomas. I'm right, aren't I? I pressed. You're not afraid of them. You're afraid of what backing down would mean. A long silence. Then, she turned fully to me, and for the first time that night, she let her mask slip. Just a little. You think I fear appearing weak, she said quietly. You are wrong. I frowned. She studied me, as if deciding whether I was worth the truth. Then, finally, she spoke. There are forces within the Empire that would rather see me dead than compromise, she admitted. If I concede to the rebels, if I allow independence, it will not be seen as pragmatism. It will be seen as failure. I stiffened, and failure means a shift in power. She nodded once. The court tolerates me because they need me. But the moment they believe I am no longer necessary, there will be war. It hit me then. This wasn't just about the rebels. This was about her survival. The war wasn't just external, it was internal. I exhaled. So either they die, or you do. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. I turned back to the city, my mind racing. If I wanted to stop this war, I had to do more than convince Zywynera. I had to find a way to keep her on the throne without bloodshed. But that meant dealing with an enemy I hadn't even seen yet. The ones waiting in the shadows. The ones pulling the strings. The real threats to the Empire weren't fighting in the wastelands. They were right here in the palace, and I had no idea who they were. The palace was a masterpiece of control. Every corridor a carefully woven thread in the Empire's vast tapestry. Every whisper a calculation. Every glance a quiet game of power. But beneath the polished stone and intricate gold filigree, something rotten festered. And I was running out of time to find it. The court was shifting. I could feel it, not in open defiance. No, that would be too easy. It was in the way conversation silenced when I entered a room, in the sidelong glances exchanged between nobles who once ignored each other. Someone was moving against Zywynera, and they weren't waiting for the war to begin to strike. I had spent my days after the last council meeting trying to track whispers, but nothing led back to a single source. It was all fragmented. Discontent from nobles who wanted a more aggressive ruler, murmurs of a faction within the military questioning her authority, even the suggestion that some within her own advisory circle had grown impatient. But no names, no proof, just a feeling that solidified when I found the dead man. He was slumped against the polished black marble of the western wing, half hidden behind a decorative column, as if someone had meant to dispose of him, but had been interrupted. His throat was slit, but not cleanly. The blade had hesitated, then pressed deeper, severing the artery in a clumsy second stroke. An amateur's kill. And yet, the man was no ordinary servant. His insignia was embroidered in deep crimson, a royal courier. Someone who handled high-level communication between the queen and her highest officials. His fingers twitched. He was still alive. I dropped to my knees beside him. Hey, stay with me. His lips parted, his breath shallow and rasping. His skin had gone pale, his pupils dilated, but his gaze locked onto mine with startling clarity. Not an accident, he choked out. I pressed my palm against the wound, though I already knew it was useless. Who did this? He swallowed, struggling for words. His fingers weakly grasped my wrist. They know. The envoy. A final, shallow breath. His body went slack. I clenched my jaw. I needed to move. The corridors were emptier than they should have been. The usual palace patrols had been rerouted, their absence another calculated move in a game I was only just beginning to understand. Someone had arranged for this man to die unseen, and they hadn't expected me to find him first. I moved fast, slipping into the restricted wing where only the queen and her highest advisors had access. The doors were locked with security protocols, but I had been given clearance weeks ago. A privilege, or perhaps a test. Inside, the chamber was dimly lit, its walls lined with shifting holographic maps of the Empire. At the center, Zywynera stood before a projection of the outer colonies, fingers steepled, her expression unreadable. She didn't look at me when she spoke. There's blood on your sleeve. I glanced down. The courier's blood had soaked into the fabric, staining the silver embroidery. He was murdered, I said, and he was carrying something important. Now she turned. Her violet gaze swept over me, sharp and assessing. What did he say? I hesitated. Something about the envoy, and that they know. A pause. Then, without a word, she moved to the control panel embedded in the chamber's main desk. A flick of her wrist, and the security feed rewound, scrolling through endless footage of the palace's halls. She stopped it at the western wing's corridor. A shadow moved against the wall. Someone cloaked in dark fabric, their face obscured, but their movements deliberate. They had waited, struck, then disappeared. Not a common assassin. Someone inside. Zuainera exhaled a slow, measured breath. The attack was not meant for the courier, she murmured. It was meant for his message. I nodded. The only question is who wanted it silenced. Her expression darkened. I can name at least 5. That wasn't comforting. She straightened, her presence shifting from thoughtful to absolute. Who else knows? No one, I said. I didn't call the guards, didn't alert the advisors. Her gaze flicked to mine, something unreadable passing behind it. Approval? Caution? You are learning, she murmured. I let out a short breath. I don't think I have a choice. She was silent for a long moment. Then, come with me. I followed her through a concealed passage at the back of the chamber, the walls narrowing, the air cooling. It was a private corridor, one I hadn't known existed. It led to a secured archive, its doors reinforced, its access requiring both her voice authorization and biometric scan. Inside, dim blue light illuminated rows of encrypted data slabs. She stopped before one and activated the interface. The projection flickered to life, displaying a list of classified correspondences. Then I saw it, the last message sent by the courier before he died. A single word, betrayal. I stared at it. That's not vague or anything. Zuainera's gaze didn't leave the screen. This was not just a warning. It was a declaration. I swallowed. You think they've already moved against you? She didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, she said, we will know soon enough. The weight of her words settled deep in my chest. I had thought the rebellion was our biggest threat. I had been wrong. The real danger had always been here, within these walls. And now the first dagger had been drawn. The palace never slept, but it knew how to pretend. In the deepest hours of the night, the halls were quieter, the shadows heavier. The ever-present hum of energy shields remained, but the footfalls of guards softened, and the whispers of courtiers faded into the background. It was a time for secrets, for movements unseen, for power to shift hands without anyone realizing until it was too late. And tonight, it was moving against us? I followed Zuainera down a passage hidden behind the archives, a place I had never been before. The walls here were different, unpolished metal, reinforced plating, the bones of the palace exposed. This wasn't part of the grand architecture meant to impress nobles. This was functional, secure, built for war. She didn't speak as we walked, and I knew better than to break the silence. At last, she stopped before a reinforced door. A panel lit beneath her palm, scanning before unlocking with a quiet hiss. Inside was a command center, smaller than the war room, but no less important. Displays flickered with real-time data feeds, planetary maps, encrypted communications. A handful of her most trusted officers stood at attention, their expressions grim. The rebellion wasn't the only war brewing. A man I recognized, Virik, the noble who had accompanied me to the rebels, stepped forward, arms folded. His usual smirk was absent. We've intercepted coded transmissions, routed through unauthorized channels inside the palace. Zuainera's expression didn't change. How many? Enough to confirm this isn't paranoia, he said. Someone on the inside is leaking intelligence. I clenched my jaw. And the assassination attempt on the courier? Vierik's gaze flicked to me. Likely related. Someone didn't want that message reaching you. Zuainera moved to the nearest console, her fingers flying across the interface. The screen shifted, displaying fragmented data logs, evidence of unauthorized access, encrypted communications, ghost trails leading nowhere. Someone was covering their tracks well, but not well enough. She exhaled. This was calculated. The timing, the method. They knew we were on the brink of war, and they want to ensure it happens. I frowned. You think they want the rebels to fight? Her gaze met mine. I think they want me gone. The rebels are just a tool. I had suspected as much, but hearing her say it confirmed something cold in my chest. This wasn't about the rebellion. This was about the throne itself. Vierik spoke, his voice lower now. We've traced some of the communications to a noble house. Not directly, but close enough to warrant suspicion. Zuainera's fingers stilled. Who? He hesitated. Then, House Sale. The air in the room shifted. House Sale was old, powerful. Not the kind to openly rebel, but the kind to engineer revolutions from behind closed doors. They had stood by Zywynera when she took the throne, but loyalty in the empire was as fluid as politics demanded. Zywynera's expression didn't waver, but I saw it, the tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers flexed just slightly before relaxing again. They weren't just betraying her. They were challenging her. She turned to me. They will move soon. I nodded. How soon? Rick crossed his arms. Depends on how desperate they are. If they think you suspect them, they won't wait long. Silence settled, heavy and expectant. Finally, Zywynera straightened, her voice smooth as glass. Then we forced their hand. I frowned. What are you planning? She looked at me, something unreadable in her gaze. A lesson. My stomach twisted. I knew that tone. Zywynera didn't give warnings. She demonstrated them. Before I could argue, she was already moving, issuing commands, orchestrating something I couldn't yet see. The room snapped into action around her. I took a breath. I had wanted another way, a path that didn't end in blood. But tonight, blood was inevitable, and I had to decide whose.